6.2, the Korean War maps. In your blank note sheet, what I'd like you to do after each time you see a map, I'd like you to pause this video, jot down the map, jot down who controls what, and take the notes either on the bottom or the side of the map. It does not need to be perfect. This is not a cartography class. It's not the study of maps. If it looks like a loaf of bread, it looks like a loaf of bread. 6.2, the Korean War map. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War. That's because it's between World War II and the Vietnam War. However, 54,000 Americans died in the Korean War, only 4,000 less than the Vietnam War. It certainly affords our attention. When we look at Korean War, when we learn about it, we need to learn some of its recent history. This is information for you. You don't need to write this down on your notes. Korea had a long history of being controlled by China or Japan. From 1910 to 1945, it was controlled by Japan. It's right next to Japan. It's right next to China. So it was an easy target. After World War II, Japan was defeated. Soviet Union quickly grabbed Manchuria and invaded northern Korea to take control of some land. And the bottom portion was controlled by the United States as it defeated Japan. Treaty made sure that it was split at the 38th parallel. The North would become a communist and South would become a non-communist country. During the Chinese Civil War, North Korea helped out the Chinese, so they were natural allies. One thing to note before we get into the actual war, something Americans didn't know was that North Korea was not going to have the support of the USSR in their invasion. The USSR would not allow them to. As we look at our characters that play in this, General Douglas MacArthur is the UN, United Nations leader, and obviously a famous American general. President Harry Truman was reelected in 1948 as the president in a really close race. In fact, the papers the next morning said, "Dewey wins," which Harry Truman happily held up to the adoring crowds when they recognized the fact that he had actually won the 1948 presidential election. The Korean War leaders, Kim Il-sung was a communist leader of North Korea, Syngman Rhee was the first president of South Korea, and Mao Zedong was the leader of China. Both men on the end are communist leaders, and Syngman Rhee is a democracy. Here's Korea. As you can see, it's west of Japan and east of China. The yellow country above is the Soviet Union. And North Korea is separated even today. This is a map of North Korea as it was right after World War II, separated by the 38th parallel. 38th parallel is, it's parallel to the equator. It's a system of measurement. It's a latitude part of to measure the globe. There's latitude, which goes around, and longitude, which goes north and south. June of 1950 is when it all began. North Korea invaded South Korea. They wished to make a united Korea and a communist united Korea. So they invaded South Korea. Interestingly enough, they timed it so because 1 month before, American troops had left their occupation of South Korea, and South Korea was on its own. South Korea is completely surprised by this invasion and actually calls for help from the UN immediately. The United Nations and American troops flood into South Korea as a police action, they call it, to stop the aggressor or the criminal North from invading a free country. Now, the United States makes up most of the United Nations military force, and it's actually led by General Douglas MacArthur. Interesting note is that the USSR had what's called a veto vote in the United Nations. That means they could have stopped the United Nations from actually helping South Korea. But they were, at the time, protesting the United Nations, and they were not there. They were protesting the fact that China, Communist China, was not a recognized country according to the United Nations. So because of that, the United Nations was able to immediately vote and step in and intervene on the side of South Korea. Unfortunately, South Korea and the United Nations did not have a good position, and they were pushed all the way into the corner of the Korean Peninsula. This is North Korean forces were outfitted with Soviet weapons, and they completely overwhelmed South Korean and UN forces until they finally find a spot to sort of rally around. And the Battle of Pusan is where the UN and South Korea stops North Korean advance. There's a pretty major stalemate there, as the United Nations and US are just too well equipped to fully defeat, and the North Koreans have too much of an advantage as far as knowing as far as their position to be pushed back. Luckily for the United States and the UN, General Douglas MacArthur has an idea. I lovingly call this the loop-de-loop. General Douglas MacArthur decides, in a move that will be learned about in military history from here on out, does what is officially known as the Incheon Landing. You can see that the city right next to Seoul is Incheon. Incheon Bay was vulnerable because the North Koreans were not prepared for this attack, and because basically the North Koreans were flanked and then cut off and surprised, they began to retreat. And retreat they did. MacArthur decides to press on past the 38th parallel. There's a decision to be made, and they decide there's a decision to be made about whether or not they would create a ceasefire and split the country at the 38th parallel again, or whether they would, the United Nations would press for the complete defeat, unconditional surrender of North Korea. MacArthur and Truman are largely involved in this decision. They decide to go for the unconditional surrender. This would, of course, unify Korea as a non-communist country. So they press on. But there's problems. Can you guess what that big red arrow is for? As UN gets closer to the Yalu River, which is the river that separates China and North Korea, China builds up its troops, and before the United Nations can really respond, 260 Chinese soldiers cross the Yalu River, attack the United Nations forces. A significantly larger amount of Chinese are fighting in this battle now than the UN has. And they're pushed back, and it's a pretty devastating push. It's overwhelmed, and they retreat a lot. One of the biggest retreats in American military history. Now, this last slide here is actually the last 2 years of the war. The previous slides were about a year. There's wild swings in the war pretty quickly, but this slide here has there's not much military movement. Now, of course, this line will go small ups and downs, and there'll be gains by each side. But the important things here are what happens sort of on the outside, or the peripheral. The UN retreats, and a bloody stalemate ensues. No other war, there's only 2 wars that have more deaths in it than the Korean War as total, and that is World War I and World War II. MacArthur wants to widen the war to China. He's upset with them for invading. He decides that he wants to use atomic bombs on Chinese cities and to attack the mainland of China. Truman says, no, that's not a very good idea. The threat that's looming over this entire war is, will this turn into World War III? Once China invaded, MacArthur basically thought that it was, and Truman recognized the fact that the Soviet Union had an atomic bomb now, and he did not want to get them involved. So he says no. Truman says yes. Or Truman says that's a bad idea. MacArthur says yes and goes to the public, and basically puts down the president publicly. And because of that insubordination, Truman fires General Douglas MacArthur. This is something so dramatic that it has not happened again until 2009, about 4 days after Barack Obama took the oath of office. He fired General McCarran, who was in charge of the war in Afghanistan, as an effort to end the war. So Truman fires MacArthur, and MacArthur is a national hero, and he comes home and makes a big speech. But the war rages on, and it continues to be a stalemate. In fact, it continues to be in play longer than Truman is president. President Eisenhower wins the 1952 election, and the former Supreme Allied Commander in the European World War II in the European theater, this former general decides he's going to press for peace. And finally, in July of 1953, almost exactly a little over 3 years after it began, there's an armistice, there's a ceasefire signed, and the Korean War is over. 2.5 million people dead, and you'll notice that the map is not very different than it was before the war. This is additional information. You don't need to write it down. North and South Korea are still at war today. There are actually soldiers that are facing each other with loaded weapons, waiting for the others to move on the border between North and South Korea. They will not communicate between each other. Kim Jong-Un, whose picture you see on the bottom right, took control in December of 2011 after his father died, Kim Jong-il, son of Kim Il-sung. So Kim Jong-un is the grandson of the original North Korean communist leader. North Korea is one of the few members of the nuclear club. They have a nuclear weapon, but a really poor economy. They haven't been able to successfully launch rockets at this point that would prove them to be an international threat, but they try to use that as a leverage to get international support and international money. Has launched small attacks near South Korea multiple times. In 2011, I believe it was, there was almost or in 2010 there was a threat of war between the two. South Korea is allied with the U.S. In fact, we have many South Korean companies that sell many things to us, including Kia. So this is a picture, a satellite picture of the Koreas at night. You can see that the borders are off just a little bit, but you'll notice the difference between the poverty-stricken North Korea and